Helen Campbell needs no introduction, but we'll do one anyway. A graduate of Southampton University in the UK, was a staff member and interpreter in the Interpretation Service of the European Commission in Brussels from 1973 to April 2011. There, she interpreted at the highest level and trained interpreters. She's continued to teach since retirement at Glendon College, York University of Toronto. She also runs courses for professional interpreters with AIIC, the AIIC, and independently, she has co-edited several literary works. The director of the National Network for Interpreters in the UK, Helen is an honorary fellow of the UK Chartered Institute of Linguists, director on its Educational Trust Board, and the director of the National Network for Interpreting of Roots into Languages. Without further ado, here is Helen. Let me make sure you can unmute yourself. And then you can get started. There you go, Helen. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sergio, and many thanks to you, Lola, too. Lola, all the thanks that have been expressed to you, I wholeheartedly endorse, and I would like to thank you as well, also for your friendship, because as you rightly pointed out many years ago, I think 2011, Lola invited me to go and speak at her conference on simultaneous interpreting. And I think you gave me something like an hour and a half, Lola. And I thought, gosh, what on earth can I say in an hour and a half? But I found enough to say. And then Lola and I have been, well, friends and colleagues since then. And we've also written a book and published a book together on recruitment of conference interpreters in general, actually. So if anybody's interested, please check with Lola about our book. Can I just get rid of one perhaps false impression on 2022? When I said I'm glad it's over, I wasn't thinking about myself at all in either question. I was thinking more about the economy, inflation, climate change problems, and especially the war in Ukraine. So when I look at those major events, it hasn't been a good year. Luckily for me, it's been quite a decent one. Yusuf, you don't have to worry about me. It was quite a decent year for me. And I still hope that the next one will be better. So that was my story of how I met Lola. As for the rest, yes, I was an European Commission staff interpreter for many, many years. I was trained by the European Commission, and then I became a trainer on that program as well as doing all sorts of other things, including a lot of administration. One of the things that has been very important for me is the link to Canada. My father, by the way, was from Toronto, so I already have Canadian blood. When I came over for that conference, when Lola invited me, she introduced me to Andrew Clifford, who was just setting up a new Master's in Conference Interpreting at Glendon College, York University in Toronto. And he asked me if I would join the team. So I did. And so I have been part of the very beginning of the Glendon course, which is something I feel is an excellent course, really very, very high level. And it's been great fun. And I'm still continuing to train on that course. And in fact, I know that there are some of our former students who are here today. That's great. And I will be there, all things being equal, for a week of training in April, when I shall certainly see Lola and also, of course, my students. That by way of a longish introduction to my topic. Well, this is another thank you to Xiang Gu, who is my fellow trainer, former student, but now fellow trainer on that program. And she asked all the trainers a number of questions. And it was because of this soliciting information for her that I had the idea of these 4 questions as an interpreter. Next slide, please. Sergio, thank you. These are the questions. First of all, booth manners. What irks you and what's useful? Then secondly, just professionalism in general, what it means. Thirdly, when you're preparing assignments, what is the most helpful aspect? What can you do to make that easier? And then I added the 4th one. What tips would you like to have received from colleagues when you started out? Now, some of the answers, next slide, please. Thank you. The next slide. First of all, let's look at the booth manners. Now, here Sergio has been encouraging you all, please, to keep your camera on. And I am going to say something quite different. Turn it off if you're not paying attention to what's going on. I have actually participated in a few conferences where people were doing eating, drinking with the camera on, and even having a workout. I'm sorry, I don't think that is quite polite to the speakers. So yes, lovely when the speaker can see everybody, that's great. But if you've other things to do and you still want to attend, you want to listen, fine, no problem, but turn the camera off. So this is to do with definitely booth manners as well. So the trainers, all of us, were asked what we thought, and here came some of the answers. You may perhaps want to add more. Loud typing on keyboards. This is if you're sitting next to somebody in a booth mainly. Scribbling. Makes a lot of noise. Please do not eat in the booth when you're working with somebody. Nobody needs to eat at any particular stage of the day, unless they have a medical condition, of course. In that case, yes, but otherwise, I've always said to my colleagues, please go outside if you want to eat. And then another bugbear was handing over to the colleague sitting next to you, but in mid-sentence. And I've also worked with colleagues who do that. As in, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, I would like to, and then they hand over. No, you don't do that. And then last, but definitely not least, punctuality. Be on time. The next one, please, Sergio. We're looking now in general behavior, demeanor. One of my fellow trainers pointed out that if you are interpreting in consecutive, in person, you should stand still, don't fidget around. Fine, I take note. Another one pointed out, these are all the replies from my colleagues, by the way, dress appropriately, no jeans or sneakers. And then another colleague said, yes, unless it's a meeting of Levi's or Adidas, in which case that would certainly be acceptable. I am referring here mainly to in-person meetings, it's true, because we're going to look also at remote working, which raises other matters. And I'm going to say it again, always be on time. And the next, please. Now, professionalism. What is professionalism to you? These are some of the answers that came in. Again, punctuality above all, looking professional. You don't have to have a dinner jacket on, but at least you should look professional, and we know what we mean by that. How else could you help colleagues? Because we are, as interpreters, working in a team. Often enough, we're the only interpreter in many cases, but usually it's in a team. And such things as writing down the numbers for your colleague, if you're sitting next to the colleague. As long as you help out, but not too pushily, not too invasively. Another person said he didn't like colleagues interfering and writing things down unless he asked first. Fair enough. That means basically talking to your colleague and deciding before the meeting starts how you'd like to go about this, what help you would like and not like. Another colleague, very definitely, he said, prepare well for your technical meetings. Research the topic. Note down the old-fashioned way or on your iPad or however you like. Note the key concepts, terminology. Use dictionaries if you have to look things up. And even when you're not actually interpreting, but your colleague is, pay attention all the time to what's going on. All of those things I would certainly endorse. I think that I always was lousy with numbers, and I was very grateful to have a colleague next to me who would give me a hand and note them down legibly, by the way. It's another thing to mention. Next one, please. Now, preparing for assignments, well, there's a bit of repetition here as well. This refers to both working in person and remote. Now, given my age and when I retired, which you already heard, I left the European Commission after all my years there in 2011. And at that stage, there was no remote. And as I don't interpret anymore, since I have retired, I teach, but I do not interpret anymore. I don't know what it's like. I can teach remotely, and I'm participating in this conference remotely, but I realize from talking to my colleagues and my students how many things have changed since the advent of the pandemic, of course, and remote conditions. So these are some of the things that my colleagues sent to Xian after her questions. Always get in touch with your colleague or colleagues, and some of them may have already participated and interpreted in the meeting you're in. They will have experience that they can share with you. And again, look things up, prepare, read up the subject, use your dictionaries, note down terminology, note down keywords. And then I've added to this, what are the issues? I can remember sometimes working in highly technical meetings when I was with the European Commission. And if I was with a colleague who had interpreted with the same group and who perhaps knew already who the participants were, those colleagues, or that particular colleague, was very helpful in telling me what had happened before. The subject might be anything to do with the environment, say. Well, if you know that the issues in that particular group are this, that, or the other, percentages of CO2, arguments about cross-border, for example, cross-border pollutions and such like, those are the things that your colleague can be very helpful about and give you a bit of background. So it's not just a question of looking everything up, it's also sounding out colleagues who have the experience. And the next one, please. Now, the tips which you might like to have had. I'm sure you've all got thoughts on this. I hear from my colleagues now, basically working in remote a lot of the time, that one of the questions that they raise is, how do you communicate with your colleagues? Previously, you were sitting in the same booth, or you could come out of your booth and go and speak to your colleagues in other booths in the same place. And that is now difficult. If you're in a hub situation, it's not so difficult. But if you're working from home and your colleague is down the road or in another town, in another country even, it does pose different challenges. So communication with colleagues. Now, a lot of ideas were bounced around when that question cropped up. One colleague of mine said, yes, there are tools that exist, the chat that we're using now, but the chat, if somebody's reeling off numbers and you want to help your colleague by writing, the chat is just too slow, so that doesn't work so well. Another idea that you may be familiar with is opening using a Google document, which you can all use throughout the meeting. That's apparently a very popular solution. And then another friend suggested, well, always create a WhatsApp group for the team of interpreters. And another added that she always used Whereby, which helped with the handover and giving each other help. The handover is something which I always have to teach students to do, even when it's in person, because they're not used to it. Having to sit in a booth with someone and know when you're finishing your chunk and handing over to the next one is actually something that requires some practice and experience. So these are just suggestions that you will probably know far more about than I do from my fellow trainers who are all still active interpreters. And the next one, please. Now, this is my bit to say how lucky I realized I was. Apart from the fact that when I was an interpreter, first of all, I was trained by senior colleagues in the European Commission. These were senior people who were not necessarily teachers. The teaching pedagogical aspects came in later on, but they were there. We could ask questions. I could sit next to somebody who'd been working for years. When we practiced dummy booth in real meetings, that meant we trainees were not allowed to switch the mic on. Of course not. You had to pass the test before you were admitted, and then you would work professionally. But before that, just practicing with the mic off was a huge, huge help, knowing what meetings looked like and sounded like. So we trainees, we could ask questions, we could follow experienced interpreters. We learned all the time. My training lasted actually 5 months, and it was very, very intensive. It was every single day practicing with other trainees, making speeches for each other, practicing consecutive, and then later on sitting in meetings, practicing with the dummy booth. So that was very, very intensive. On top of it all, we had wonderful equipment. The EU does have beautiful booths, the standard size, excellent, constantly upgraded equipment, and technicians on hand all the time. Now that actually recently has been the subject of much discussion and difficulties, because while the technicians are in Brussels, where the interpreters are, the delegates are very often not, or have not been present in Brussels, but will be participating from the member states. So that has actually raised lots of problems, but I didn't have them. I had the constant support of our technical staff, and I really benefited from it. Now I'm thinking, what would it be like now to start out and be working at home in front of my screen with my microphone, but without a colleague next to me, without a technician ready to jump in if need be. These things are really big questions now for any interpreter just starting out. Working conditions need to be examined and monitored all the time because they change. Technology changes, the way of communication changes, as indeed it has. And the next one, please. This is me, definitely. In case you're wondering why I'm saying the next slide, is because I asked Sergio to do this for me, because no, technology is not my thing. I've had to learn to use Zoom, of course. I teach online. I've had to persuade myself to do these things, but it isn't my forte. I know from all my colleagues who do work from home that they have to be very well equipped. Again, this is new. You need one computer or two, as many have now. At least one smartphone, if not two. You need a good speed. I ran a online consecutive workshop just after 2020, so just after the pandemic began. So in Zoom, fine. And I suddenly found that people couldn't hear me, the sound was cutting out. Wi-Fi, the Wi-Fi was just not and is not reliable. So I acquired a cable. These are all things I learned, and I'm sure that young interpreters know, and also experienced interpreters now know very well. If you have Apple, which I do, you need to have a constant flow of adapters, because we know what Apple does. It changes everything, and you have to keep buying more adapters. You need a good headset. You need a really decent table mic, preferably, and you need to be able to interpret, of course, in a quiet place, preferably completely soundproofed. All of that is completely new and certainly would be new to me. But you will know more about it than I do. And next, please. So this is my take-home message, as they say. Everything changes all the time. It changed during the years when I was interpreting. We had, for example, 6 languages going to 9 languages, going to 15 languages, and now it's 24 in the European Union. Everything changes in this profession, which is one of the joys of it, by the way. But we need to be on top of those changes. Decent working conditions are essential, yes. When I started, there had just been a big battle to move the interpreters of the European Commission out of the booths that existed then because they were full of asbestos. Can you imagine? That's just the way it was then. And now there are other problems that need to be solved. And that means cooperation between the international organizations, the employers in general, agencies, and Lola, of course, again, has to be mentioned here because Lola is one person who really cares about her translators and interpreters. That is, I believe, fairly rare as well. We need to thank her for that. And international associations like AIIC, they need to work together to make sure that the new challenges are being met so that interpreters can work in proper conditions, can hear clearly, which is the most important thing. And I think that is probably the key to how we should be looking at interpreting in future. And I think I can round off on that note. And again, thank you to Xiang for providing the questions and the answers from my colleagues that I could collect together. And I look forward to any questions you might have. And thank you for inviting me.
Great. Thank you so much, Helen. That was fantastic. I love a lot of the tech recommendations you had, which I definitely agree with. An Ethernet cable and a good microphone. Those are things I've been talking about for a while. So it's great to see that we're on the same page with that. If you have questions for Helen, we've got a couple minutes. Raise your virtual hand. It'll bring you to the top. I'll unmute you and then you can ask your question. If you prefer to type your question in the chat, Helen, I can read out a couple of those also. I'm seeing a couple of questions about the attendance, so don't worry about that. At our next little break, I will give a little refresher for that. So if anyone has questions for Helen, please raise your virtual hand or put them in the chat. I see them all said. Thank you so much, Helen. Great to see you. Youssef, I see you've got a question. Let me add you to the spotlight and ask to unmute.
Thanks, Sergio. Am I audible? Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Helen, thanks a lot for your time and for such a great presentation. I always ask myself what Helen will talk about this year or when we hold a conference. I just have a question about during your time at the European Commission while training or working, was there a special attention for mental health of interpreters? Were you guys given, let's say, a chance to express yourself, whether you were doing good, whether you are enjoying or not enjoying the work conditions that you were put under? That's my first question. And my second question, if you can touch on how we as interpreters can let employers know that remote conditions are not meant to be a deduction from our rates. So remote conditions are as draining, as exhausting sometimes, as demanding as being in person. Unfortunately, some employers, even here in Canada, think that because we are working remotely, then they have the right to just deduct from interpreters' rate. How can we, as interpreters, advocate for that? And thanks again. So good to see you.
It's great to see you as well, Yusuf. It's really nice. You know, when you've trained somebody and then you see how well they're doing, as you are, that's perhaps the greatest thing of all. It's just wonderful. I'm very happy. It means that some of the training we've been giving you must have been useful somewhere along the line, Yusuf, because you're doing fine now. Thank you for your questions. Yes, in the old days, there wasn't such a thing as mental health ever mentioned. This is, you know, it just didn't exist, or it did, of course, but it wasn't talked about. However, that was right at the beginning, shall we say, in the 70s. Things have improved, and there has been a lot more interest, I think, between well, in this case, it was the European Commission administration and the situation for the interpreters. As for how are you doing, yes, we have an assessment. We're all assessed every year. So you can assess your English team of interpreters or your French team and so forth There's always an opportunity for the interpreters to talk to their line manager, I suppose you'd call that, direct head of unit on issues. And as for the working conditions, which have changed so much with remote, well, it's still ongoing. Obviously, not enough thought was put into what might happen if, Youssef, for example, a friend of mine who was working for the European Parliament recently, he's in Brussels, he's in the hub, because that's where they all work with the lovely booths and so forth. But the Spanish minister he was interpreting was sitting in his office in Madrid with the window open, and the traffic noise was so horrific he could hardly hear. These are things which are currently being dealt with at the moment. In fact, there was a strike by the European Parliament interpreters because of this. So that is an issue that needs to be addressed even more. I think probably I would be against a strike under any circumstances unless it's really desperate. But yes, there is discussion going on. This is being worked on. And as to whether the interpreters' well-being, mental well-being as well, is being addressed, yes, it is now. Your second question, I don't think I can help you because, as I said, I do not interpret now, and I've always only worked for an international organization, the European Commission. I'm horrified to hear that employers are actually cutting down the rate because you're working remotely. The conditions are much worse remotely, I would suggest, and therefore, if anything, you should be getting more rather than less. And I think that the answer to that, Youssef, and to everybody else who's interested, would be, as my last slide said, cooperation. The employers need to talk to a sensible sounding head of the team of interpreters who can talk without getting upset and excited about it, and explain. You need to explain to everybody who is not an interpreter, i.e. most people, what it is that we need in order to provide a good service and in order to allow people to communicate. But if not, if people are cutting rates at the moment, that I think is rather dreadful, I must admit. But anyway, very interesting questions. Thank you, Youssef. I hope I've answered them sufficiently well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Helen. We also have a question from Wendy. It's 10:25, so we've got time for this one last question. Wendy asks, as an organization using translation and interpreting services, what are the best practices for us to support this work?
So I'm not quite sure what, I don't quite know, who do you mean by us? Because I don't represent anything. I was a staff member of an international organization, the European Commission, but yeah. I'm not quite sure how I'm supposed to understand the question. Sorry.
Yeah. So Wendy's actually
Wendy,
got her.
Can you explain?
Yeah, I'm going to ask her to unmute. Wendy, go ahead.
Hi. Yes. So I work for a corporation and we hire a lot of interpreters and we send in a lot of documents for translation. And so I'm just wondering, I had a colleague recently say, you know, the best idea for interpreters is to meet them ahead of time, to have a discussion, things like that. So I'm new to this, to hiring these services. So I'm just wondering how I can best work together with you to make it as successful as possible. So what can I supply ahead of time, that type of thing. So, yeah.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. First of all, maybe you'd like to consult Lola's and my book, because that has quite a lot of very useful information in it. Don't you agree, Lola, on what you need to do when you're hiring interpreters? But the most important thing is communicate beforehand. If you get in touch, there is always a head of team of interpreters, at least in my experience and most people's. There will be one person who is responsible, who's the mouthpiece, the spokesperson. Discuss with them before the meeting. What do they need? What documentation is available? But everything from, if it's remote, how are you going, what platform are you using, and such like. I think communication is the single most important thing here. Going straight into a meeting without having consulted your interpreters is bound to be fraught with problems. So that's, you've said it yourself, so I'm just endorsing your very good suggestion to you.
And if I could
before
add,
the meeting.
Yeah, thank you, Helen. If I could add, and absolutely, I posted the link to the book that Helen and myself published a few years ago. I posted on the chat, and also the professional associations are a good source for information. For example, national standards. For interpreting, we have the National Standard Guide on interpreting services, or for translation, translation standards usually provide like guidelines on what are the expectations, the roles of different people, what we are supposed to be doing. So checking on the standards is really a good practice to see what are the best practices for, to work with translators, what are the best practices to work with interpreters. That really help. And Wendy, I'll be happy to send you some further details on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Lola. Absolutely.
Yeah, well, thank you so much.